this mic okay? Can you guys hear me? That's good news, maybe. It may also be bad news, you'll find out. I'm going to be a little shorter than I had originally planned because the conference is having a flexible day, let's say. And so in appreciation of that, we're going to speed things up a little bit. But I won't just talk faster, I'll just, say less. I want to, first of all, express my absolute gratitude to have been invited to be here. I am incredibly conscious that when one is invited to speak at a child youth care conference in South Africa, that's sort of like being invited to drive a BMW or a Mercedes or something. It's, as somebody mentioned earlier today, in the rest of the world, people really look to South Africa to figure out what child youth care actually is and can be. So I feel very awkward because really I have very little to offer that you don't either already do, that you could do if you wanted to, that you've done 20 years ago. Frankly, you are ahead of the world, so bear with me as I try to catch up. I want to say special thanks, of course, to the NACCW, but also I'm very pleased that UNICEF is here. I am very pleased that, that politicians come to your conferences because you need to know that no matter how that turns out, that in much of the world politicians don't come to child and youth care conferences. So it is really an indication of the importance of child and youth care in South Africa and of the accomplishment of child and youth care practitioners in South Africa, that politicians feel the need to come. Regardless of what they actually say, and generally my advice is listen for a bit and then tune out, but nevertheless, regardless of what they actually say, it's important that they come. And I think you should be very proud of yourselves that you're important enough for them to feel that they must come and speak to you directly. I think that's a really great accomplishment. I also, just by name, I just want to acknowledge Don, because every time I come to South Africa, I see Don, and I say to myself, wow, I've lived during a time when I get to be and speak with and just be in the presence of Don. I think his inspiration to our entire field, to the country, to the world is incredible. The last time I saw Don, he gave me a couple of books of his poetry, and it's very impactful, so thank you for that. Okay. In a relatively short period of time, I want to just share some stories and thoughts that very directly relate to national development, one child at a time, the theme of this conference. Although I should actually, before I do that, also just make a confession right off the bat. Because here's my plan. Somebody is filming me right now. And the reason somebody is filming me right now is because when I get back home to Canada, I'm going to take that film and I'm going to put in front of it your reaction to the speaker, or rather singer, just before lunch. And then I'm going to show everybody that this is what it looks like when I do a keynote speech. So thank you for that. That is very helpful to me. I really appreciate that. So, I've been involved in child and youth care for a very long time. In fact, my entire adult life, and I'm glad that's the case because I wouldn't want to do anything different. But I've learned a few things in that process, and I really want to share those things with you in a fairly abrupt kind of a way, so that you can think about them as we go. So I'll tell you 3 very quick stories. The first story is, some years ago, I worked in a group home, and the group home needed to be renovated. So I said to the young people, all teenagers who lived in the group home, let's go camping for a week so they can do the work and renovate the group home, and when we come back, we got a new house. It'll be great. So off we went camping. And we went to a family campground where lots of families go camping, and there were my 10 youth and me. And, the 10 youth did as 10 youth do. And they were pretty loud, and they were being young. And so the people who owned the campground came to me and said, listen, here's the thing. The families are complaining about you guys being here. You're too loud, you swear too much, you do too many things. It's not okay. And I think the families are going to tell me that I need to kick you guys out. But we're going to decide that tomorrow. I said, okay, thanks for sharing that. And I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do with that? So I went to the young people and I said, here's the thing, guys. We're going to get kicked out tomorrow if the families decide that that's what should happen. That's a problem because our home is being renovated and we got nowhere to go. So could you guys solve this problem, please? And then I went to the beach and I spent the day on the beach. Because I had no way of solving this problem. I asked them to solve this problem. I figured, well, it's the only day I'm going to be here, so I might as well enjoy the day and, catch some sunshine. At the time, that was considered responsible child youth care practice. Today, not so much. And later in the afternoon, I went back, and what I saw was amazing. Because what the youth had done is they started playing games and asking the kids of the families who were camping to join them. And so the entire campground became a community in which everybody was playing and having a great time. And what I learned from that story is if you want to solve a problem, the best thing you can possibly do as a child youth care practitioner is to get out of the way and trust that young people can solve problems that to us are very difficult to solve. And those young people certainly came through on that. Another story. At a different time, I was working with a young person who really didn't want to be working with anybody. He didn't want to have therapy, he didn't want to listen to any psychologists, he didn't want to go to sessions, he didn't want to do anything. And so in the local community where this was happening, we exhausted all the services and he sort of didn't want to do any of that. So we went to a different city to try some different kinds of services. And we stayed at a hotel. And very slowly, it took a couple of days, but very slowly the young person suddenly was totally into getting to the sessions and doing the work that he was asked to do without complaining very much, and actually seemed eager to get the day going and then to go back to the hotel. And after a few days I asked him, I said, what changed? The city doesn't seem that much better than our city. Why are you suddenly into it? And he said, well, the thing is that I get up long before you do, and I come downstairs into the hotel lobby, and the guy who is the night guard is like the greatest guy ever. And I spend a good hour just hanging out with that guy and talking to him. And so I look forward all day for the day to be done so that tomorrow morning can come, and I can hang out with this guy again because I'm really enjoying that relationship. And I thought to myself, well, that's amazing, because we're spending thousands of dollars hiring psychologists and social workers and clinicians and treatment people, and the person who's making a difference in your life is the person who works nights at this hotel, just because that person is offering you a connection that you're not finding anywhere else. It turns out that healing sometimes is not a function of professional service, but is a function of connection, a good fit, a good match, and maybe abandoning the professional language and the professional concepts and the way we are with people professionally in order to be with people authentically. And so I learned that authenticity is actually a major component of excellent child and youth care practice, and that there are people in our communities everywhere, whether they work the night shift at a hotel, or they work in the local store, or whatever it is they're doing, who can make a huge difference in the lives of the young people we are told require professional help. So that was the second story. And the third story, sort of building on that theme, is just last year I was at the big mental health conference in Ontario, the province I live in Canada. And the keynote speaker at that conference was a young person who had lived through various system kind of interventions. She was by then about 20, 21. And she used her keynote to tell everybody, how difficult her life was, the challenges she encountered, the kinds of things that happened, and the failed therapy and this and that. And then at the very end of her keynote speech, she said, and what got me through it all was my participation in soccer, writing music, and this one really good friend I have. And once again, and people got up and applauded wildly. These were all clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, those kinds of people. And I thought to myself, you know, you guys are applauding, not realizing that she just totally dissed you. Because she didn't say what got me through my challenges were the clinical counseling sessions. She didn't say it was the medication you hooked me up with. Oh no, it was playing soccer. It was writing music, and it was hanging out with a friend. And so once again, it kind of taught me that healing or finding ways in which people feel, young people feel validated and important and healthy is not always a function of the things we pay a lot of money for, but very often is a function of how we feel connected to community, how we create communities around us, and how communities around us accept us, integrate us, are with us. And so I thought these three stories all have as a thread the idea that child and youth care practice is a lot more than what meets the eye. That there is a lot more going on, and also, and this is the main point I want to make in now 25 minutes or less, and also that therefore the potential of child and youth care practice, whether that's in South Africa or in Canada or in Australia or in Ireland, is huge, really huge, with a minor twist in the way we think about child and youth care practice. Is that okay so far? You guys are very quiet. Usually, you know, somebody complains about something. Is we good? You all good? Yes? Yes? Okay. I don't seem to be able to generate the kind of noise the previous speaker did, but it's okay. I got it on tape, so don't worry about it. Okay. So a good friend of mine that is also a friend of yours, Tom Garfat, coined the phrase child and youth care is a way of being in the world. You know, and I really love that phrase for its ambition. You know, the phrase is not child and youth care is a way of sitting in an office and talking to someone. The phrase is not child and youth care is a way of behavior management or of intervening in some crisis. It's a way of being in the world. It's so much more than being with one child in one moment. It's a way of being in the world. And I really, really love the ambition of that phrase. And I think we should live up to that ambition and be a particular way in the world. And be connected to the world that our young people live in. Even more so than just that moment in which we might have a chance to have a conversation with a young person. Because we might really structure that moment exceptionally well, but for the young person, the world continues around them as that moment unfolds and passes. And so, the challenge today in the 21st century, we're well into that century, is what world are we talking about? You know, the world that we are living in today is not the same world that I grew up in, and it's probably not the same world from even 10 years ago. Change is everywhere. And you know the changes that are unfolding, and you know that they're unfolding at a much more rapid rate than they ever have before. Climate change is not a hoax, contrary to somebody holding high office in a faraway country. It is not a hoax, it's real, and it's affecting people's lives right now, at this moment. Drinking water is scarce for many, many people. The ability to plant food has diminished for many, many people. This really matters. Economic transformations really matter. You know, one of the things that we often do, we certainly do this in Canada, I'm not sure exactly how you handle it in South Africa, but when young people come into care of the state, of child welfare, or in a group home or whatever, and we know that they are going to have to transition to somewhat independent life, they're going to have to make it on their own in some way eventually, we try to prepare them by building job skills, by training them in, you know, how to manage money, by helping them figure out how to cook nutritious meals and so on. But the reality is most of the time we're preparing young people to live in minimum wage or chronic poverty economies. We are asking them to take jobs that will ensure that they will chronically not have enough to get by. And that's a real problem because it turns out the economy is not providing for the kind of career laddering that it once did. And so we have to begin to think differently about that. Maybe what we need is not a preparation for minimum wage jobs, if there even is minimum wage, but rather what we need is preparation for an innovation economy, for entrepreneurship, for something that allows young people to make a life that is more than a condemnation to chronic poverty. We know that migration is having a huge impact on how life is lived. It is having an impact on the nature of the state. It is having an impact in our communities. And more importantly, it's having an impact on the experiences that young people have as they're growing up and as they're going from place to place. Our communication world has completely been turned upside down between social media, fake news, and various other things. We really have no idea anymore how to manage or contain the way we are communicating in this world. We know that Google is in more places around the world than the United Nations. We know that if an organization has a choice of hosting the General Secretary of the United Nations or the CEO of Google, most organizations would choose the CEO of Google because you'll get more money. That's an interesting phenomenon that has never happened before. It turns out that in the world in which we live right now, the actors who really are seen as the ones influencing the way the world works are not really the well-meaning actors from international organizations, from NGOs, from places where we have some trust that the intentions are good. That's a big change. And we know that there is a massive education gap affecting everybody, including us right now, in terms of what we learn and what we learn about, versus what we actually need to function in a world that is changing all around us really rapidly. I was amused last night at the reception that was held. There were a number of young people who were participating in the technology project here, and they were talking about software they're using to create apps to solve problems in their community. And they were awesome. The young people were absolutely awesome. But I thought to myself, I wonder how many people in this room, amongst the adults, have any idea what they're talking about. Chances are, you don't know how to use this software. You know, that's a very likely scenario. And I think that's actually, it's funny, but it's also a problem because we keep hearing, and we heard it here today, that young people look to you to prepare them or to be with them as they engage in a world that is rapidly changing. And it turns out we're doing that equipped with tools that are not quite on par with where the world is at. And so we really have to think that through and figure out what we're going to do with that. The image, by the way, that is on this slide, by the way, I'm terrible with images on PowerPoint slides, so they're mostly random. But this one actually is not random. This is Ai Weiwei, who is a very famous Chinese artist, part of the democracy movement in China. And it is an image about change. What he's holding on one of the slides here is a vase from the Ming Dynasty, which is, you know, an antique. It's a very valuable thing. And he's dropping it, and it breaks, and nothing changes in the way he's looking or in his posture. And the point he's trying to make is that sometimes we have to let go of some things. And we can't always try to pull our own traditions into a world in which people are developing new traditions and new ways of being that fit for them. And so I thought it was actually a powerful image. Okay, so all of this has a big impact on the nation itself. We don't like to talk about this very often, especially at big gatherings, because we're proud of our nation and we think, you know, it's great to be South African. But it turns out that being South African may not mean the same thing to everybody who lives in South Africa. Much like it most certainly is not the same thing for everybody who lives in Canada. Being Canadian is not the same thing for everybody who lives in Canada. And so really, the nation as we've always known it, the nation we're trying to build, is being built in a different world, which means that the nation itself is something that we have to think about a little bit and have to figure out what nation are we trying to build here? Whose nation are we trying to build? Democracy, which we sort of assume is the end goal of everything, is hardly safe. We live in an era in which democracy itself is really a highly questionable concept. Not just in countries that are usually associated with having some challenges around democracy, but even in the countries that call themselves the protectors of democracy, we're not really sure whether what we're looking at actually is democracy. We're not really sure if this basic principle of everybody is worth the same holds anywhere anymore. We know corruption is on the rise. We know national identities are getting more and more complex. What is it to be South African? What do you have to be to qualify? We know that national histories are being rediscovered. There are people who have been on this land, whether it's here or in Canada, for much longer than most of us. What are those histories? Whose national history do we tell when in our textbooks, in our schools, and so on? We know that national borders aren't what they used to be. National borders are highly porous. People are crossing national borders, whether they're allowed to or not. And by the way, good for them. Let me just put that in there as a political point. But nevertheless, people are crossing borders, left, right, and center. We know that every community around us, right here in Durban, but in every city around the world, languages are multiplying, religions are multiplying, ethnicities are multiplying, culture and ways of living are multiplying. Everything from food to music to the way we interact to the way people shake hands. This, for me, at my age, has become a huge challenge. When people try and approach me to shake my hand, I never know what I'm going to be doing, you know? It's a real challenge. But all of this has a huge impact on how we think about nations. The assumption that nation means that we all belong to some community, that there is a place for us in that community, is just that, it's an assumption. Somehow we have to consciously actually operationalize that and make sure that the way we do that is inclusive so that no one is left out. Our history on that is terrible. Like, we have really no good reason to believe that we are good at this, because we have not been good at this anywhere in the world. And so we need someone who can try and help us figure out how to get good at that, how to build community in such a way that it is inclusive and that it offers more opportunity, not condemnation to subsistence. Within that context, we talk about life space. Some people like the term, some people don't. But let's be clear that when we talk about life space, we are talking about a very complicated kind of a space. Children's lives are not unfolding in the spaces that are easy for us to access. They are unfolding in shifting spaces, in fluid spaces. They are in transit. They are in temporary housing. Some young people here in Canada, in other countries, experience 10, 15, 20 different houses per year in which they are living. They live on the streets, they live among peers, they live in digital media. That's a challenge for us. And they live in families, but families are often not the notion of family that we think about when we think about family. Often they're constructed families. And they live very different lives. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. Because, you know, one of the things that Child and Youth Care has done well and can continue to do well, but we have to remember to do it well, is that we have to appreciate that not everybody is with us in the same context. That when we sit with a young person or a group of young people, or we enter a school or a community, we're not entering a group of people who are living the same lives. Some of those people may live that, some of those young people may live life with a family that they recognize and appreciate as family. Others may live life with a feeling of deep loss of family. Some live life at what they might call home. Others live life in a precarious housing context. Some go to school, some may or may not have access to school. Some get to be part of a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple. Others, they're too difficult to be part of those things, or deemed too difficult. Some may identify with a cultural community.
Others may need many cultural communities in order to find themselves in the multiplicity of their identities. And some live in the relative context of peace and safety. Many others live in a context of violence and possible trauma. And so it's important that we recognize that as child and youth care practitioners, the child and the youth are not all the same. There is massive diversity amongst children and youth, even children and youth who are in front of us in the same classroom, asked to study the same thing, to perform the same actions. And because that is the case, we can't simply use the same ideas to practice child and youth care with everybody. That doesn't actually work, because when we try to do that over a long period of time, what we're really asking young people to do is to adapt to our professional needs, to do the work the way in which we think we should do it. And as soon as we do that, we have lost all credibility in the context of talking about participation, of talking about children's rights, of talking about young people matter. Because it turns out that professional groups, all professional groups, whether they're doctors, psychiatrists, or whatever, have a tendency to see the protection of their profession as more important than the actions that they're actually doing in the community. This is a risk. It has always been a risk. We have to rise above that risk and do better than that. There's a random picture of my beautiful wife who's seated there, and myself. You know, one of the things that I always worry about is the proclamation that somebody is an expert. And I always say to people, don't, whatever you do, please don't call me an expert. Far too much pressure, I don't want that. But many professional groups who do good things, I don't want to diss anybody. I like social workers, I like psychiatrists, I like everybody. But many professional groups have held out the idea of being experts in what they do as the goal. This is where they wanted to land. This is how they want to be seen. Because they feel this is what gives credibility. And I think for me, the beauty of child and youth care is that we don't claim to be experts. I hope we will never claim to be experts. Because if we start claiming we are experts, we are starting to claim that we are experts in somebody else's life. And we will never be experts in somebody else's life. On a good day, we can hope to be somewhat experts in our own life, but most certainly not the lives of the young people or their families or their communities that we encounter, that we engage with every day. Because we know they are the experts in their life, and we're present. And they will determine just how much we get to be in their lives and how much we don't get to be in those lives. And so I think if one asks the question, you know, why do we need child and youth care practice? We already have social workers, who I like. We already have psychologists. We already have psychiatrists and doctors and nurses and so on. I say we need child and youth care practice because the only hope for innovation left is child and youth care practice. Professional disciplines that have worked toward becoming experts on something can no longer be innovative because they have to abide by what they call their expertise. And it turns out expertise is not a super dynamic concept. Once you're proclaimed an expert, you're busy protecting that status. Child and youth care practitioners have no need to be experts on anything. We don't want to be experts. Because the lives of young people don't require experts. The concept of healing does not require expertise. It requires presence. It requires engagement. It requires care. It requires love. It requires all kinds of things in which none of us will ever claim to be experts. Unless somebody here, please put up your hand, claims to be an expert on matters of love, because that would make for a much more entertaining keynote. So, you know. Any volunteers? So for me, child and youth care, really, the reason it is so important is because it is the innovation in the social sector space. It is the only way in which we engage with that space by ways that include moving between spaces. We don't need an office. Sometimes it's nice to have an office to put your coat down, but you don't need one. We don't need an office. We are good at connecting things across different experiences. Whatever might have happened to you in family probably has a relationship to what's happening for you in school, which probably is not at least unrelated to the general violence that might be unfolding in your community, which may have something to do around, I don't know, how drugs manifest themselves in your life. And we can be in all those spaces. Without judgment, we just understand that life is about many different spaces coming together to form a way of being in the world at which we are happy to be present. This creates the context for innovation. Izibindi, in a way, is an innovation precisely because it really takes as its starting point the multiplicity of things that might be acting upon the experience, the life experience of a young person. It takes into account issues of safety, but it also takes into account issues of play, issues of growth, issues of learning, and so on. I gotta skip some things in order to keep to my promise. But I think we still have to think bigger than that. We really do. Because, and here, allow me to, at least for one moment, say something critical about the theme of the conference. You know, the one child at a time thing is a very loving statement, and of course, every child who might benefit from our presence is a wonderful thing. Of course, we're happy about that. But let's also be real. We're not really talking about a problem that is about one child. We're talking about millions of young people. And associated with those young people are millions of mothers, adults. And associated with those women are millions of other people who are finding life to be extraordinarily challenging in a context in which the value they are given does not correspond to the value one ought to give to everybody's humanity. The problem, the scale of the problem that we are hoping to be engaged in, this is the, perfect. Okay. The scale, that was very nuanced. I have to compliment you, that was very nuanced. It's, the scale of the problem is huge. And in many ways, we have to acknowledge that although there are 1,000 of us here, there are millions of people out there who we need to become present with. And so how do we do that? How can we multiply what we have to offer to correspond to the scale in which we have to make a difference? And again, some of you are already doing that in the context of your work, but I think the answer to that question is that what we do as child and youth care practitioners is not just be with one young person at a time and give everything and put everything into that one interaction or that one relationship, but it really is to transfer the idea of connection across entire communities. So that the night guard that I mentioned earlier who works in a hotel becomes a supporting actor in the work that we do. So that the person who owns the local grocery store, or the person who runs a farm, or the person, even the person who might live on the edge of deviance, becomes a resource in the way in which we build environments around young people that are helpful and that allow young people to begin to solve their own problems. It's about expanding our footprint. It is going from the interpersonal to community. It is going from relationship to networks of relationships. Every connection that we make ought to have a multiplier associated with it, with other people in the community who begin to use those connections in such a way that they become available resources to young people living in those communities and beyond. It is about moving away from damaged frames. I really discourage, I just want to be honest about that, I really discourage the stories we sometimes tell about how this poor young person had such an absolutely horrible life, and thankfully we found them a nice family and now they're going to university. You know, that's a terrible story. Because that story really is about constructing young people as severely damaged, and thank God we're around to heal them. It's not about that. If we're true to child and youth care practice, our starting point is that the greatest resource in the life of a young person is that young person and his, her, or their friends, and everybody else who lives around them and who has a role in the community in which they live. And our task is to become community builders as much as it is to be present for one young person at a time when crisis ensues and when somebody really needs just for you to be there. So it is moving from individual success, which is good. I applaud every young person who ends up experiencing success. But it is moving from individual success as the goal to collective power as the goal. The power of young people to matter and to affect their own lives in ways that really make a difference and that become sustainable. I'm going to skip that one. So it's about child and youth care everywhere. You know, I was for a long time a skeptic about advocating for child and youth care practice to enter all the different social spaces in which young people live their lives, partly because I was worried about setting up wars between different professions. I changed my mind on that. I think we should be everywhere. I think we should be in schools. I think we should be in hospitals, in residential care, in the military, in refugee camps, in the digital life space. And I think we should be there because it turns out that we need to build connections both within and between all of those places in order to build a framework in which young people can actually themselves operationalize their rights, their entitlements, and their capacities to build the future that we clearly have not built for them. And let's be honest about that, we really haven't. So 4 core principles, and I'll just end on those. The first one is we don't have to abandon the idea of relational practice. We just have to make sure that we're being relational in community, that we're connecting and building networks of lots of different people, all of whom have something to contribute to the well-being, to the opportunities for young people. Participation. Without participation, we can just pack it up. Let me be clear about that. There's nothing else going on, nothing to see. Participation is the core of what we need to get to. And it's very hard to get to participation when you believe yourself to be an expert on something because you don't need anybody to participate then. So participation really, fundamentally, is about teaching young people to negotiate and then choosing to lose. That part is really important because if we don't step back and allow things to go into ways that weren't necessarily what we had in mind, there is no real participation. Okay? Sometimes participation means, let's see what happens. This conference, by the way, is a good example of participation. Lots of people seem to participate in the making of the schedule of the conference, so that's good, you know, let's see what happens. Life-based intervention is about fluid spaces, about spaces culture, about belonging and healing as an opportunity. But fundamentally, leadership is about moving away from the center to make room for young people and their communities. It's about getting out of the way. You know, I know that many of us make a lot of money and many of us make very little money trying to create contexts in which people can create change in their lives. I think we would do a lot better doing a little less of that and just letting people try and figure it out, including young people. It turns out they figure out amazing things. And we have to be ready for that and be prepared for that. Leadership is not taking charge. Leadership is making room for other people to take charge of the things that matter to them. And because I'm out of, that's my dog Jax. Because I'm out of time, I'm just going to say thank you very much.